Welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed a fabulous lunch. It is 1:30 on the dot, and we like to be punctual over here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next presenters. It's going to be Dr. Ken Tape and Sebastian Zavoico, both from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, here to speak to us about beavers in the Arctic. So with that, I will pass it off to you two.
Thank you so much. How's everyone doing? You get a good lunch? Right on. Hey, thanks a lot for the Beaver Institute, to the Beaver Institute for having us. My name's Ken Tape. I changed the title a little bit from what's in the program to Beavers Transform Tundra Streams and the Future Arctic. And this is from the Woolek River in August. Sebastian and I floated it with a couple colleagues. And this is beavers at the northern edge of their range, way up in northwest Alaska. This river flows into the Bering Sea. These ponds weren't here 5 years ago, and so this is kind of what it looks like at the northern edge of their range as beavers move into the tundra. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes. I'm going to go pretty fast and then turn it over to Sebastian to talk a little bit more about biology. I'm going to show you a few pictures of the Arctic for those of you who haven't been there or haven't been there for a while. This is the Congacut River in northwest Alaska. This is what permafrost, ice-rich permafrost, frozen ground that underlies the Arctic looks like. This is Pleistocene permafrost. It's a matrix of frozen soil and ice, and this is what is thawing as the climate warms up there. Here's a view of a lowland area affected by beavers. There's a lodge right here. There's some beaver dams in here. These aren't real obvious ponds, but again, these are the lowland areas of tundra that beavers are moving into and changing. There's some granite tors in the tundra in winter. This is the Brooks Range in northern Alaska in fall. Again, we're about 10 miles from tree line and about 10 miles from the edge of Beaver Range. And so here's a idealized figure that National Geographic published 5 years ago now, that shows some of the different changes going on in the tundra. So the beavers are moving into this area, but the Arctic tundra is already changing rapidly due to climate change. The Arctic tundra is warming, I think, 4 times faster than the global average. So things are changing in the Arctic, and that's what we studied before we encountered beavers about 8 years ago. So you got things like wildfires, retreating glaciers, this frozen ground is thawing, which is hard to see because it's underground, but you get the surface expression of it, these thaw slumps, thaw ponds like this. With longer, warmer summers and shorter winters, you got the expansion of shrubby vegetation and then new herbivores moving into that new habitat in the tundra, such as moose and now beavers. So in 2020, we started the Arctic Beaver Observation Network, which is a 5-year NSF-funded project, and it's really to facilitate pan-Arctic coordination of scientific research, indigenous knowledge, and maybe even management. And we had a meeting up in Fairbanks in February of this year, and you can see a few of the participants there. And this is my research group from last summer, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. That's what a beaver pond in the Arctic looks like. You're looking down on it. There's a lodge. That dam is about 85 meters long in this picture, and it's about twice as long now. This will be very familiar to you guys. I don't need to tell you about beavers, so I'll breeze through a few of these. This one's been around for a little bit longer. This is actually more of an alpine area, not true Arctic. This is what it looks like in the winter. It's absolutely incredible. And you know, we didn't come to this from the beaver angle, and we're not really focused on a lot of the beaver biology just because we're really looking at the impacts of these ponds on the ecosystem. But you just cannot help but marvel at what they are doing up there. So this is a snow machine with 2 sleds on it, and we go out there, and this is early April. That's a beaver lodge right there. There's a pond right here. You drill holes, the ice is 1.5 meters thick, and sometimes it's sitting right on the sediment in the bottom of the pond. Sometimes there might be a 0.5 meter worth of water at the bottom. And so how they're actually keeping their cache from freezing in and things like that is just an absolute marvel and just fun to witness. So here's what beaver colonization in the Arctic looks like from from aerial photography, from satellite images. 1980, this is a color infrared photo, so everything that's red is actually green. This is very familiar to you guys, of course. That's a stream about as wide as a table or wide as an office. And by the time 2019 rolls around, it's just been completely transformed. It turns out the local cartoonist in Fairbanks had this all figured out. He prophesized this. This cartoon is from 2001. And indeed, this is exactly the scene that has been playing out for the last 20 years and continues to play out across northern and western Alaska as beavers move into these unengineered streams and really transform them. Here's another example. This is tundra areas in western Alaska. This stream flows into the Bering Sea around Nome. So here you have in 2003, no beavers. By 2016, totally different. So some of our big science questions are, what is the scale of beaver engineering in the Arctic? And we can say that we have the answer for that in Alaska. It's huge. So, early on in this process, the shrewd reviewer would say, well, might accuse this of just being sort of a scientific novelty, but in fact what we're looking at is a whole new disturbance regime, and it's more analogous to something like wildfire coming into the Arctic tundra than it is analogous to something like moose moving into the Arctic. And you guys all know that because you know the effect that beavers have. And then this big question of what is the nature of beaver impacts in the Arctic? Because if we want to understand what the future Arctic tundra looks like, we can't do that anymore without understanding the impacts of beavers. It's not just climate change, it's this new engineer that's coming in and changing things. So we're starting to understand that beavers thaw permafrost, but I'm going to leave it to Sebastian to talk about some of the biological research he's doing. So here's what that increase in beaver ponds looks like. This is Kotzebue, Alaska, which just got hammered by a huge fall storm that they did not predict and is actually partly underwater right now, way up in northwest Alaska on the Bering Sea. In 2002, behind town, there were 2 dams. By 2019, there's about 100 dams. If you look at a little bit bigger area, in 2010, you had 94 dams. By 2019, over 400 dams. So beavers like this area, and they're absolutely moving in and finding suitable habitat. On the scale of Arctic Alaska, so everything in gray here is the boreal forest. Everything colored is the Arctic tundra. And this is a color scale, right? So the blue areas have no beavers. So the entire north slope of Alaska, this is the continental divide of the Brooks Range. So there's a mountain range that runs all the way down. This is the continental divide. They're right at the continental divide. And there is an entire lowland landscape to the north that our modeling shows will be occupied, depending on the climate scenario you use, at 2050, 2090. So it's really a very interesting thing to be studying, and it's really happening in real time. You can see that this is really the footprint of the disturbance regime. So you can see the areas where they've already colonized in the last 20 to 30 years. So yeah, we mapped over 12,000 beaver ponds in the Arctic tundra, Alaska, which, I don't know, seemed like a lot when I was doing it. Here's our team. This is sort of my acknowledgements slide, or at least part of our team. Paige up here is studying carbon cycling. Rodrigo is doing subsurface imaging, so we do ground penetrating radar of permafrost in the subsurface, which is super interesting because it allows you to see where these ice bodies are and how they're possibly going to change as these beaver ponds come into the system. Mike Colgate, Katie Anthony at UAF is studying methane. Will Samuel studying fish biology. Tom Glass is a postdoc doing groundwater ecology and permafrost. Sebastian's going to talk here in a few minutes about his work on biology. And then Ben Jones, my colleague, has been working with me on this from the beginning. And Emily Graham is also studying permafrost. So we're studying as much as we can. But if you're interested in this kind of research, or if you have some expertise to contribute, we really can't do it all. I was not an aquatic ecologist 8 years ago, and so I'm still coming up to speed on a lot of this stuff, and we like collaborating with people who have the relevant expertise and interest in implementing something that they are interested in. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian, and he's going to talk a little bit about impacts to biology that he's learning about from these beaver ponds.
Cool, thanks everyone. All those people in the back, do you wanna come forward if you want to find a seat? I know I've been in your position before. I just want to take a second to scooch in, make some room. Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Ken, for starting us off, and thanks everybody for being here. My name is Sebastian Zavoico. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. I'm broadly very interested in community ecology and understanding what the future Arctic looks like. And of course, beaver engineering is an incredible avenue to understand community change in the Arctic, especially where communities are shifting super quickly in response to climate change. So I'm going to go over kind of a brief overview of my PhD project, where I look at the biological impacts of beaver ponds in the Arctic. And I'm dividing it into 3 chapters that are under the umbrella of what I call the Arctic oasis hypothesis, that beaver ponds harbor unique biological communities that bolster landscape biodiversity and productivity. And productivity and biodiversity are very closely linked. My first chapter focuses on vegetation, and I'll spend the next few slides going into a little bit more detail, where for all of these, the main driver of change that really differs between the Arctic and the lower 48 and more temperate latitudes of Canada and beaver impacts is that they are thawing permafrost, and that is one of the main drivers of the change that really makes it unique. So the first chapter looks at vegetation, where I hypothesize that beaver ponds increase the terrestrial vegetation productivity through permafrost. The second is looking at the aquatic community, where I hypothesize that beaver ponds will increase the biodiversity of invertebrates, but not necessarily fishes. The third, I'm looking at avian communities, where I hypothesize that beaver ponds house unique assemblages of songbirds and attract waterfowl and shorebirds during migration through their change of ice cover throughout the whole year. So looking at vegetation first, asking the questions of, are areas more productive around beaver ponds than control streams? If you look at this satellite image, you can see the floodplain is roughly kind of this wide. Outside of this floodplain is permafrost, like Ken was showing. Thick ice wedges, frozen soil. Inside this floodplain is a lot less permafrost because the river is thermally and mechanically taking the permafrost away. But what we find with a lot of these ponds is that they extend the floodplain away from what was formerly this permafrost-free zone, and not just by inundating the permafrost, but they're and thus thawing it. They're also elevating the groundwater table far away from the pond edge and thawing permafrost there. So that's kind of the main driver of vegetation productivity, where now these shrubs are able to root down further and access more nutrients that before weren't accessible to them. I'm using remote sensing to find these beaver ponds and also to conduct analysis. We're trying to gain as broad a view across many different environmental gradients across the Northwest Arctic to understand broadly what all these different patterns of vegetation change are. And to do that, remote sensing is a really great tool because we can study a lot of different beaver ponds across a very, very large area that's very difficult to access. Some preliminary analysis is that, yes, we're finding higher productivity. So these graphs all show vegetation productivity with the normalized differential vegetation index, or NDVI. What's interesting is that the differences in between control sites that haven't yet been impacted by beavers and beaver ponds, there is a difference, but only from the 20-meter to the 30-meter buffer zones. So we're not finding any difference in the 0 to 10-meter zone, and that's maybe because these areas that are newly disturbed, they're kind of changing vegetation communities from more shrub-like ones to more wetland-like ones that aren't necessarily more productive. But further away, and we also see this with methane production, we find more methane hotspots up to 60 meters away from beaver ponds than control areas. So, and that's probably also driven by permafrost thaw. Looking at aquatic communities, looking at invertebrates and fishes, where for invertebrates, I'm hypothesizing higher biodiversity than in control areas, and that's because of increased habitat complexity as well as more nutrients, which is kind of a similar signal as we see in the lower 48. For fishes, however, we hypothesize that biodiversity will be lower. A lot of these Arctic specialist species like Arctic char, Dolly Varden, whitefishes, they have not evolved with beavers and oftentimes just turn around as soon as they see a dam. So beavers did not have not had the chance yet to teach fish how to jump in the Arctic. Where the method that I'm using to understand aquatic communities is through environmental DNA, where we filter water and we keep those filters, and then we sequence the DNA to different species. And we do this for a number of different taxa types. So there are primer sets that are specific to invertebrates, to fishes, which I will show you the preliminary results of next. So these are NMDS plots, which is just a fancy way of showing similarity between different communities. So each of these different points represent the community structure and assemblage of one single site. And I've grouped them here by the type of stream that we sampled. So we have these beaver ponds, we have control areas, and we have the streams that are just above, upstream of beaver ponds. These two primer sets are two different primer sets for invertebrates, and what we're looking at here is kind of similarity, right? So that the closer two different points are, the more similar they are across this like very complex gradients that's simplified into these two different axes. And what we find is that all of these groups really nicely group together for invertebrates, showing unique community assemblages between these different areas. It doesn't mean that there's more biodiversity or more richness, it's just that they are unique communities. So we're finding that ponds are indeed unique from controls, and they are also unique from the upstream areas from beaver ponds for invertebrates. The story is similar for vertebrates, and that includes fishes, but also goes to things like otter and mink and moose and caribou. But it's not so similar for fish. For fish, they're all kind of pretty similar. When we look at just richness at the genus level, we find that my hypothesis is more or less supported, where for invertebrates, richness is much higher for ponds than it is in any of the other areas. For vertebrates, though, and for fishes, that breaks down. So in control areas, there's much higher species richness than in ponds or in the streams, and then for fish as well. These are just a handful of sites that we're analyzing. So right now, we've sent all of our samples to a company here in Boulder, like 3 days before I flew down. I could have delivered it to their front door, but I decided FedEx should take the responsibility over 250 samples over me. The third chapter focuses on the avian community, where I hypothesize that beaver ponds house unique assemblages. And that's mainly because through their changing of vegetation communities, but then also the water, overall surface area of water and habitat complexity that has been shown to benefit a lot of waterfowl and shorebirds in other areas as well. The main way that I'm doing this is using these acoustic recorders and game cameras. And we should be hearing some songbirds. That it's already very much winter in Fairbanks as well as the Arctic. And though I don't have any preliminary analysis yet, just listening to this in already very dark and snowy place is giving me a lot of joy and life. So I don't have any preliminary analysis yet, but I have 27 of these doodads out there that are recording 5 minutes every hour, creating recordings like this of American tree sparrows and Savannah sparrows, willow ptarmigan, Wilson snipes in this recording, as well as many, many others. And I plan to do this similar kind of analysis of community structure between beaver ponds, controls, drained ponds, all these different things that beavers keep on giving us. So, and then we're using the game cameras to kind of catch some of these things that aren't necessarily always vocalizing, but do appear. These are two great white-fronted geese that are, 19th of May is when this is on the day that the water broke up, the ice broke up. So kind of hammering home how different these ponds are. They're freezing over around the 5th of October and then opening up around mid-May. It's a tremendously long time that these beavers are existing under the ice. So just kind of going beyond my project too, we're through these game cameras, we're also finding some other critters. So these are brown bears that one of which had opinions on where our camera was facing. Did anybody see the beavers on the lodge? The bear on the lodge and the beaver? I'm going to play it again just if anybody didn't catch it. The beaver swimming very nervously and this bear poking up over the lodge. We also see a lot of moose. A lot of things really liked our snow stakes that we had in front of these game cameras. We see a lot of otters. We named this one Johnson. Johnson appears very often at one of our sites closer to Kotzebue. And here's another shot closer to tree line, showing that really otters are just furry slinkies. We see a lot of red foxes. We see in areas at the edge of tree line. We also see pine marten and mink. We also see, of course, willow ptarmigan, lots and lots and lots of willow ptarmigan. So with that, thank you all for coming today, and we have a few minutes for questions. Ken, do you want to come up? Yeah, I guess we can. I don't know how to do the Hoover thing. Yeah, we have mainly, we only get to go to these 11 sites that we're studying twice a year. They're very, very remote and very expensive for us to get to. So we've only analyzed samples that we've taken in August, which is when we go out there. We go out in August because that's when the permafrost is at its lowest extent. That's right before it starts freezing over again. We have done some winter sampling, but we haven't analyzed those yet. The winter samples are really difficult to manage when the temperature is -20, -25 Fahrenheit out. So those have been a little bit more challenging to take, but yeah, yeah, thanks for the question. Behind the bay, yeah. Ken, do you want to take this?
That's a great question. Sebastian talked about the concept of the oasis. And so in most cases, it seems like what the beaver is doing is creating these warm water, permafrost thaw oases of higher biodiversity and things like that. So in most cases, it seems like beavers are accelerating the effects of climate change, increasing biodiversity, giving a foothold for these other species. So yeah, beavers are causing permafrost thaw in these areas. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I don't see it as a uniquely positive or negative thing. I mean, there's a complex array of things that we're just beginning to understand. There certainly are some negative aspects, but some positive ones as well. Sir? Well, I mean, if you look at the picture with like one beaver pond after another, then it starts to look significant. Yeah, increasing the rate of permafrost thaw all around streams across the Arctic seems like it could be a big deal. How are they different than a temperate beaver? That's a great question that I do not know the answer to. But as is super interesting, like the adaptations that they're using up here, it's like, where did you learn that? Ma'am? It depends on where you look. It's some far north areas, they like on the central North Slope, they've never been there. There are no bones at a site that has bones going back, 70,000 years. At the same time, one of those areas behind Kotzebue that I showed that was recently colonized, that area we find ancient beaver chew that we're actually dating and working with some people in the room here. So yes, they have been there in the past, but those particular dates are around 8,000 years old. So it's not like they were there before the fur trade and they're just reoccupying their former range. I think they're beyond that now, but it's a great question, and we don't really have the context.